For several years, there has been this completely racist paradigm where you're supposed to suspend your disbelief and accept that based upon a specific kind of stereotype or what I think they want you to believe is an archetype of people from certain ethnic backgrounds, that they are committed to living their life in an abstraction. That you're supposed to focus on the other side of the brain, so to speak. Things are supposed to be fantastic. You're supposed to use a sort of visualization in order to create an intention and then allow for that to manifest, which means you don't want to be critical and you don't want to be too literal because things are kind of in a sort of surreality. And when I was on the street and homeless, there was one way to deal with that. And now that I'm living inside and presumably it's not a bad neighborhood I'm living in, that I'm supposed to accept this in a different manner, as if there's some sort of entitlement, but also as if there's some sort of expectation of appreciation. And I don't know how to do that, honestly, because it's so racist, right? Because a lot of times there are specific archetypes of people that get derivated into a stereotype that disconnects them. They're bifurcated. And I started experiencing this literally, and I've reported on it before. One of the first things that when the stores started opening up after COVID 19 started happening, they said you have to stand 6 feet apart, the social distancing. Well, what happened if you were in an area, including a store, for instance, public space was allowed to be open, that had a lot of surveillance and had a lot of electronic equipment, including electronic equipment that has some sort of Bluetooth technology or some sort of digital transmission. And you went up, and somebody came within 6 feet of you being there. How about when you're in the workplace and you're alone doing something at your workstation, but then somebody else comes up on the right side? And you're like, whoa, and then they walk away and then they come at you from the left side and you're like, whoa, that's completely different. That's what COVID is, isn't it? They've literally split our mental functionings in half. They've bifurcated our psychological processes, and then they've created these systems of automation where they try to pair different halves. And a lot of what I understand has been happening is this kind of illegal, amoral, and inappropriate sort of central counterparty strategy where they want you to visualize something that you might like and that might appeal to you, that might be something that's synergistic with your aesthetic, something you find aesthetically pleasing. Maybe it's something culturally or socially nostalgic, including something that you've known, including something that might actually literally be a part of your cultural legacy. And you're supposed to derivate into the abstraction and allow for that kind of process to go on. While they pair you with whoever it is they want to pair you with, and depending upon how compliant you've been with their expectations of performance, they'll oftentimes pair you with somebody that you're supposed to abstract into something that you would prefer to be with in order to yield to that which is actually your opposition. And the whole process is love your enemy, right? You've got to understand it from their perspective. And this has been engineered for a long time. You can even see it at the level of policy, the Federal Reserve, when all of a sudden the actual value of being a worker was eliminated. The actual indexing of labor data was eliminated right before Congress let the actual legislative authority to support federal workers. It just lapsed. And then all of a sudden, everybody's in workers' struggle. CEOs are dealing with resiliency in this economic paradigm. People in Congress and the Senate are having to deal with all of this stress, and not only having to deal with what's going on legislatively, but responding to COVID 19 and rising to the occasion during the crisis. I want to know something very practical, and I want to know it in the next 24 hours. How many people that were previously employed in jobs that would be considered blue collar jobs in the United States are dead now? How many people in our actual manufacturing sector, regardless of the country of origin, honestly, regardless of their actual place of origin, how many of them are dead right now? How many American workers were murdered in the last year so that you can import another labor force and try to reduce the standard, especially because we're dealing with a critical infrastructure investment overhaul? Are you going to offer them citizenship, or are you going to treat them like those members of the military, the people that were born in other countries and served their country, and then you found a reason to deport south of the US-Mexico border and organized and orchestrated a paradigm where the only acknowledgement they're going to get in the United States is as immigrants with a drug and alcohol abuse and or mental health problem? How many people that used to be American workers did you murder in order to transition your economy, including your energy paradigm, including how many women are you importing or did you import? They're supposed to be grateful that they're in the United States. So they have been completely dispossessed of their right to say, no, I do not consent. You're not allowed to try to compel me to do things I do not consent to. It's a crime. And I have the protections of the Constitution and rights to due process in telling you you're not allowed to tell me I have to do that for a place to sleep, for something to eat, for clothing to wear, for transportation, for what I understand to be necessary health care, much less a job where I can make my own money and have a bank account in my own name, or maybe even a lease in my name that I pay with the money I make myself on the way to saving up to support my small business that you're not allowed to sell off to people claiming they're in the military to use for contract bidding, while I'm actually obstructed from being able to pay off the loans that I've taken out to support my small business. And I'm on the way to, if not already having put it into effect, for me to have a mortgage in my own name so that I actually own my own property and I can pay my own insurance. How many of those people did you murder? Because I'm not hearing in the last year and a half any futures being created for those people. The futures you've orchestrated based on the people you've murdered weren't about homeowners. They weren't about people that had actually earned, by the way, a pension. They weren't about people that provided substantial support to organizing a community network. They weren't people that were actually able to assist with remedying a problem in their country of origin and making some sort of international cultural exchange, right? Those aren't the futures you created. Those aren't the white futures you created. Those aren't the black futures you created. And if you're talking about education, what do we have when it comes to education? What are the futures that you've created for the children? You trade those futures. And you try to get us to live in some sort of abstracted fantasy scape where we create things, but we're not even allowed to be acknowledged for our own creations. See, I'm very critical. It's a skill. There used to be a time where people like me were highly valued. We were highly contested too. That was part of the, spirit, right? There's actually a value to this. You already know that. You don't want me to know what you value it at, right? I'm supposed to be destitute. I'm supposed to be catastrophized. I'm supposed to be distressed, which gives meaning to a particular sector of people, right? A sector of people who, by the way, needed administration in order to make sure they were compliant with the law so that they could bill and get paid. And that was actually something I was professionally trained to do when I was in a situation where I was given the future comparable to the ones you're creating now for other people. Somebody that had experienced trauma, somebody that had been diagnosed as having a medical problem, somebody that needed some sort of administrative or structural support in making a transition. I went through that. You didn't believe what my version was. You had another version, so I accepted it. I went through your program. I became an administrator in compliance regarding billing for Medicare, among other things. Policy research on patient protections and standards related to practitioners, including of mental health, laws regarding prescription of medications, including rights in the event of a offer to participate in a clinical trial. I was professionally trained as part of your programming for people who had a need. You have not called on me once in your emergency. You haven't called on me once. And every time I'm actually observing, seeing what's going on, none of it registers as being justified on that side of the brain you want somebody else to get credit for. And meanwhile, what's going on in that side of the brain regarding visualization? How many people did you lock away in their houses with amazing imaginations, including people that might have the aesthetic you prefer, that are creating and dreaming? There's no reflection of that. Who did you sell their futures to? Who did you try to torment into being the beautiful girl that pleases you? The attractive man that's humble and ready to serve eagerly at a moment's notice? Who are all these heroic figures that are so grateful for all the hard work you're putting into responding to this emergency? They're not reflected anywhere. They're not in the media. They're not represented in whatever you think your legislative priorities are, either on the local level, the state level, or the federal level. You didn't create those futures, at least not for any of us. And now, all of a sudden, after 20 years of creating one of the world's most heinous human test subject aquariums, terrariums, whatever you want to call it, theaters in Afghanistan, now we're all supposed to be so excited to embrace another round of Afghani refugees. See, it's so insincere because you didn't create any futures for them. All you did was recycle, right? And in the course of that, you didn't clean up your own. Disposed, right? You didn't clean up after yourself. Again. And it makes the entire country, everybody in this country, including the new people you're importing, look like we would have accepted it if we knew what it was. And see, my problem is I don't have any way to give anybody credit or acknowledgement for plausible deniability. Instead, what it proves is that the first time this started happening after the 2008 banking crisis and up through beginning of 2011, it was absolutely 100% known, including by a lot of people who just kept quiet. And they played out this sort of derivation and abstraction. They created a fantasy scape. Maybe it was dramatic. Maybe it was comedic. Maybe it was based on metaphor and myth. Maybe it was some sort of historical romance. See, I know that I created amazing, beautiful things. Some people may not like them. Some people might think it's disturbing. Some people might think it's highly specialized and highly desirable. But you took all of that away from me and told me I was sick. And now I've watched how the people who did get that in complete alienation from understanding its source origin are being told they're sick. I don't believe you. I don't believe you're sick. I don't believe you actually have a virus. I don't believe you were hacked. I do believe you're broke. I do believe you intended to make a lot of other people broke so that you could broker them. I do believe that, and I believe you're unqualified. And not only do I believe you're unqualified, I believe you murdered people that were actually qualified so that you could try to supplant them. Now, I've gone through this process where I've tried to be literal in responding to emergencies, actual emergencies, and also understanding that a particular kind of tempo or pace would have prevented things from escalating into an emergency. I tried to deal with this from a public health perspective, including first response to what was alleged to be a pandemic, and addressing public health matters during a time frame wherein there was massive fraud going on involving a state of emergency, presumably connected to a natural disaster. I've tried to deal with it from a law enforcement perspective, including in a manner that would de-escalate what could potentially escalate into a fatal event, and or deal with fraud on the inside that allows for corruption to proliferate, including corruption that aids and abets narco-terrorism in other countries. I've tried to deal with this from a legal perspective. Despite the fact that I was denied due process, I tried to represent myself pro se in the best manner possible in order to make sure that my cause was acknowledged, so that it was understood at every step of the way that I, in no way, shape, or form, was willing to cooperate with what I knew was crime. I even tried to deal with this from a military perspective, understanding that I put myself out there as saying I had an intention to be a candidate for office, and that would make me the civilian authority in addressing matters regarding the military, including the role of the military in the United States, including during a terrorist attack or some effort to address a pandemic situation. All of that, what did you do with it? So now where are we? Now we're dealing with one of the most elite advisory societies in American industry. They have the ear of the president and have for several presidential administrations. You should see the guest list for dinner when they get invited. I have. At least for a while. It was public information, right? And they've got a deadline in about 10 hours, right? Because this is what you put as my reality. And I understand that I have as much and as little authority to do what I did as any of the rest of you. I think the big difference is that whole argument that Frantz Fanon tried to make. I know, we don't really want to talk about him. Last time I did, I was naked, and that's the way you wanted it. Well, I have my jacket now, so I'll bring it up again. It's not about being willing to die to prove your point. It's about being willing to kill, right? What were you all willing to kill for? You haven't created any future. You haven't given us any culture. You haven't given us any society. I've seen your infrastructure plan. It's one of the most disgraceful things that anybody could have concocted, even if you try to get into the other side of the brain and think that you're engaging the eons and the angelic realms, and so you've got little sheriffs and, angelics running around trying to get you all those things you need. That's not what that is. It's a slander against anybody that actually had faith, including enough faith to not actually die yet. Right? What were you willing to kill for? What were you willing to kill for? I told you. I wanted consideration under a piece of legislation specifically invoking the death penalty for certain kinds of charges. I knew exactly what that meant. And what it meant is at some point, people that claim they're entitled to say they're representing the people through the state have to take responsibility for what it means to be willing to kill for something. You wouldn't even acknowledge me, but all kinds of people ended up dead. What were you willing to kill for? What was so important that you could kill off so many people without creating any future for the rest of us?